and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the age of conservatism. And again, we're going to start here and pick up and get us through from the 1980s all the way to the present day. So strap in, let's get ready to go. But as always, before we begin, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other, and of course, their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's strap in and get started. So, 1980, it's an election year. We're coming out of a decade that, well, kind of sucked, 1970s. And we find that the 1980s is going to mark a dramatic shift in U.S. politics as the election of Ronald Reagan signaled the final death of the liberal consensus that had existed since the 1930s, and a shift instead to what became conservatism, a process that had begun back in 1920 with Harding's return to normalcy, that went dormant during the 30s and 40s thanks to the Depression and World War II, but that reemerged as a minor kind of element during the 50s. But what became known as movement conservatism, these intellectual think tanks, didn't have a lot of traction in the 60s. Yes, Nixon gets elected in 68 and it swayed a little back the other way, but even Nixon, despite cutting funding for some things, would still see a pretty big federal government. But by 1980, movement conservatives had a new opportunity, and thanks to a terrible economy in the 1970s, a decade of mistrust and distrust of Democrats thanks to LBJ in Vietnam, as well as Democratic Jimmy Carter's poor handling of the economy, and most recently, 1980, an Iranian hostage crisis, where the Iranians had taken U.S. civilians hostage. Reagan came on the scene, and he became a leading spokesperson against the Great Society, specifically Medicare and Medicaid. And whereas the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, was dour and gloomy and kind of boring, Reagan was sunny, he was cheerful, and he promised strong leadership. And Reagan will swiftly try to implement his proposals. Now, early on, his main focus was increasing defense spending, the Cold War, while reducing social spending. So we're going to cut social programs so we can put more money to our military. And we're going to introduce sweeping tax reform. And so within his first year in office, Congress will pass the entire Reagan economic package, which included some votes from some Democrats. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 will cut personal income tax by 25%. You see it highlighted on the graph on your screen. These tax cuts, coupled with increased defense spending, did seem to restart the economy. But that was largely because of massive government spending in military. It would also generate massive federal deficits. The federal debt grew larger than all of Reagan's predecessors combined. But yet early on, the economic slump continued. Of course, how do you adjust for huge debts? Yep, you cut funding to programs. And so cutting the budget became a major priority for the Reagan administration. He pushed through $35 billion in budget cuts. Now, again, not defense, Not going to stick to the wealthy. No, no. This is going to education, housing, food stamps, school lunch programs. A move that some historians point to as kind of starting our modern obesity problem in the United States. In other words, this $35 billion in cuts was largely aimed at welfare programs, the social safety net. But to be clear, the basic safety social net of the New Deal and Great Society, i.e. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, were not touched by Reagan. Even Reagan could not touch these programs. And so when it comes to being a wealthy person, Reagan seemed to be your best friend. If you were a lower socioeconomic working class person, you're going to feel the pinch here. Oh, and things get worse if you're one of those working class people. Because Reagan, who himself was an actor in Hollywood, he was also the former president of SAG, which is the Screen Actors Guild, the Screen Actors Union. But despite being the former president of SAG, he also immediately went on to attack labor unions. Take the August 3rd, 1981 strike of PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. So on August 3rd, 1981, some 13,000 air traffic controllers went on strike during the peak summer travel season right before kids go back to school. This grounded 7,000 flights. This is a major disruption. The strike was doing what it's supposed to do. Ronald Reagan branded the strike illegal. He threatened to fire any air traffic controller who failed to return to work within 48 hours. And when the majority did not return to work, Reagan fired 11,000 air traffic controllers for striking and imposed a lifetime ban on rehiring those strikers. In October of 1981, the Federal Labor Relations Authority decertified PATCO as an official union. And for those 11,000 strikers who got fired, they all had to find new work. And that ban on being rehired from their jobs would remain until President Bill Clinton reinstated it in 1993, some 12 years later, which by that point, let's be realistic, it was largely ceremonial by Clinton, because who's going back to their air traffic controller job 12 years later? But on a bigger issue, when Reagan said no to unions, the wealthy, largely Anglo U.S. business leaders were given a lesson in managerial leadership. Conservative government now had their back, harkening back to the 1920s and the Gilded Age. And it wasn't just PATCO. In 1983, there was a strike at the Phelps Dodge mine. You see, in 1983, the Phelps Dodge Corporation, who runs the vast majority of mines in the Southwest, rejected contract terms proposed by its mostly Mexican-American workforce at an Arizona copper mine. The workers went on strike. And rather than negotiate, the Phelps Dodge Corporation replaced its striking workers, i.e. they fired them, to rid itself of the union. And like the PATCO, by 1985, the union was decertified. But this was still not the end of it. The larger union, United Steelworkers of America, brought men and women from all over the country to picket in front of the mine, including an all-female picket line. The court ordered that striking miners could not picket as they were blocking the entrance. That's what picketers do. That's what strikers do. That's how strikes work. You have to prevent new workers from coming in. But that's part of strike. That's legal under the union laws of the country, on the Wagner Act in the 1930s. But nonetheless, this is a more friendly, business-friendly president. Using 400 state troopers, armed personnel carriers, helicopters, and 7 units of the Arizona National Guard, the Felt Dodge Company reopened their mine. Martial law was declared. Hundreds of Mexican Americans arrested. Unions were under attack across the country. The NFA, I keep saying NFA, the NFW, National Farm Workers under Cesar Chavez. In 1980, before Reagan took over, they had a membership of about 60,000. By the time Reagan's ready to leave office, by the end of the 80s, they're down to just 10,000 members. Unions were under attack. Now, to try to fix some of the problems, again, unions busted. Reagan is a friend of big businesses. He's cutting corporate taxes and taxes on the wealthy. He's cutting, in order to save the budget, he's cutting welfare entitlement programs. He also does something else. And to me, this is a fascinating one because there's both goods and bads here. And there was a huge undocumented immigrant problem, perceived problem, in the 1980s. Most of whom were of Mexican descent. And on November 6, 1986, the Reagan administration will sign what was known as URCA, or the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Now, it does a number of things. And I want to kind of go through these a little slowly, because there's some good and some bad here. And on the one hand, it now required employers to attest to their employees' immigration status. So all employers now had to find out the immigration status of their employees. In other words, they couldn't hire undocumented immigrants. It made it illegal to hire or recruit undocumented immigrants knowingly. That's a key word there, knowingly. But it also did something else. So that was aimed, of course, at the employers. It also did something else, which was it provided amnesty. Yes, Reagan, who hardline Republican, gave amnesty. He said, you can't just deport all these people who have been here for so long. And so what officially URCA did was offer amnesty and legalize undocumented immigrants who had entered the United States prior to January 1st of 1982. So remember, this was signed in 1986, almost the end of 1986. So this is going back 4 full years here. But you had to be in the country prior to January 1st, 1982. You had to have resided in the country continuously, and you would not have to pay a fine or pay back taxes or admit guilt. All you had to prove was that you were A, continuing in the country. You had to be free of guilt of crimes other than the undocumented immigrant status. And as long as you did this and you possessed a minimal knowledge about U.S. history, government, and English language, you could apply for amnesty. In fact, my mother-in-law was able to get her citizenship largely as a result of URCA. Now, what is the impact of this? Well, 3.2 million undocumented immigrants were able to obtain citizenship. But, you remember that thing I said earlier about it now on employers to determine and verify the citizenship status of employees, and that you couldn't do so knowingly hiring them? Well, rather than deal with having to prove citizenship status, many employers just decided to discriminate against workers who might appear foreign, including brown skin. They also developed a more devious thing, which was the use of a subcontractor for hiring practices. And so if you're a large corporation, rather than hire people directly, which requires you to verify the status of their employees, instead use a subcontracting firm, where the smaller entity their job was to gather the employees. And that way, with the subcontractor, you would be able to have plausible deniability and not be held liable if one of those employees turned up to be undocumented. So it was plausible deniability. Now you might be thinking, well, who cares here? Well, first and foremost, the use of a subcontractor also decreased worker wages because a portion was kept by that third-party subcontractor. And this indirect hiring was imposed on everybody, regardless of your immigration status. This is still a practice that's done in the 21st century. And there was an article that came out a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic started, where large movie theater chains still use this exclusively and use subcontracting to exploit undocumented workers. Because these subcontractor groups are easy to come and go. They don't have to worry about the large shareholders or corporations to deal with. More on that later. Now, while URCA was obviously being targeted at undocumented immigrants, Mexicanos would also undergo some substantial dramatic changes in the 1980s. In the decade of the 1970s, the Mexicano population of the United States nearly doubled, from 4.5 million to 8 million residents, including the approximate 1.1 million undocumented immigrants from Mexico. By 1980, their number would increase by 45% to 12.5 million. So in just over a decade, in just 2 decades, from 1970 to the end of the 1980s, the Mexicano population of the United States went from 4.5 million to 12.5 million people. That's a substantial change. The problem was, under Reagan's economic policy known as Reaganomics or trickle-down economics, where you cut taxes on the wealthy, and then theoretically, as they get more money, the wealthy do, they'll reinvest in their companies and businesses and the economy, and the wealth will trickle down to the poorer people. Under Reagan's economic policy, though, it coincided with a steep decline in American manufacturing. And the result of this was that poverty levels for Mexicanos was 3 times higher than that of Anglos. The cut to social welfare programs caused many of the gains made by Mexicanos and African Americans back in the 60s and early 70s to be erased. And this was all by design. Reagan was the idea that you must pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. In his inaugural address, Reagan laid out the mantra of, quote, "Government is not the solution to your problems. It is the problem," unquote. And so, fueled by the Reagan Revolution, the new right, which would include a large number of both Mexicanos and Latinos in general, would mobilize against bilingual education, against affirmative action that had helped minority students get into college. It eliminated the fairness doctrine on TV and public radio that had required public media channels to base their stories on facts and to present both sides of the question. With that gone, the Fairness Doctrine, talk radio took off with radio shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh, who began to contrast their ideal country with what they viewed as socialism around them. A world in which hardworking white men, whose only care in life was to take care of their wives and children, were being hemmed in by a government that was taxing them and giving benefits to lazy people of color. Sound familiar? In all of this, the higher poverty rates, the bilingual education, the affirmative action, the Fairness Doctrine ending, it all created new additional stigmas and racism against Mexicanos that would once again see them funneled into non-college track courses, leading to a 50% dropout rate for Mexicanos in K-12 education. And this was even being fueled by some conservative Hispanics, including Linda Chavez. She came to Washington, D.C. in the early 70s as a committed civil rights activist. But over the decades, she became and leaned more and more to the right. By 1983, she was appointed by Reagan as staff director on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. She was what one historian labeled, quote, the Mexican-American arc conservative, who advocated for going slow in seeing civil rights, unquote. She was opposed to providing busing. Remember, the thing about busing, if you don't understand, is without busing provided by schools, if you are a poorer person or a person of color who can't afford transportation, or both your parents work, or whatever the reason, you can't get to the better schools. And the result of that is essentially segregated schools where whites who can afford it go to the better schools and they can get transportation by their parents. Without busing from the schools, which is publicly paid for, you can't. And it slows down integration of public schools. She opposed affirmative action. Now, you guys don't know what affirmative action is. Affirmative action was used as a way to hire and recruit, so for either for jobs or for colleges, as a way to say, okay, we need to increase our diversity, increase the number of applicants and, hirings or admissions of people of color. This was often done by essentially lowering the bar or standard, realizing that because of historic forces and historic segregation of schools, students who are persons of color did not receive the same opportunity as their Anglo counterparts, and so to allow them admittance. She opposed the Equal Rights Amendment for women that would guarantee women equal rights in the Constitution. She then bashed the executive director of LULAC, Arnold Torres, who, you realize LULAC's a very conservative organization, but she said leaders like him, quote, seem intent on vying with African Americans for permanent victim status, rather than seek recognition for the genuine progress by Hispanics over the last 3 decades, unquote. She actually would run for Maryland senator in 1986 unsuccessfully. Reagan would try to appoint her as a Secretary of Labor, but that itself fell apart after it was found out that she was employing an undocumented Guatemalan immigrant as a domestic housekeeper. But it was decisions by Reagan such as her, by appointing Chavez, and his push for so-called rugged individualism, that led 1/3 of all supporters, all Hispanics, to vote for Reagan. And so, where we talked about before, Nixon had got 31% of the vote, Reagan was getting more than 1/3. So he actually increased the amount of Hispanics who voted for Republicans. Now, outside Washington, the 80s would also see a number of great political advances for Latinos. And the better the economy did, which, yes, the 80s economy would turn around, and most would benefit. even though it seemed like the majority of the population was suffering still. Now, in 1983, a coalition of Mexican American Anglos would help elect Federico Pena as the mayor of Dallas, the first Mexican American mayor of the nation. He would help greatly to modernize Denver into a modern city. Also in 1983, the Mexican American and Puerto Rican populations helped African Americans elect the first African American Chicago. Still in 1983, voters in New Mexico would elect Tony Anaya as governor, a progressive who opposed the death penalty and declared New Mexico a sanctuary for political refugees from Central America. Even in Michigan, 1987, my hometown of Flint, in a coalition of Mexicano and African American city councilmen, they would rename 2 streets in the city, one to honor Cesar Chavez and the other to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Chavez Drive in Flint would become the first street in the nation to honor the labor rights leader, according to Chavez himself. But what this did, politically speaking, was to the Reagan himself. Yeah, there's some huge wins here, even for progressive candidates, progressive ideals. But on a national level, our country was becoming much more conservative, much more right-leaning. And what this meant was that if Democrats wanted to win a presidential election, they needed to change their message, their branding. And in 1992, Democrats will finally emerge from the wilderness with a cohesive vision. Because the reality is, the Reagan Revolution had fundamentally transformed American politics, shifting the entire political spectrum to the right. That old New Deal liberal consensus, liberal welfare state, Keynesian economic policies seem crusty and stale within the modern American mindset. And as a result of that, if you were someone like Lyndon B. Johnson, who at one point was here on the spectrum, a decent leaning left, yes, but not too far from center still. But if you're that same Lyndon Johnson now, you are no longer here. You're still here in the Democratic political spectrum. But notice how far now away you are from center. That's a much bigger gap. You look like a more radical, left-leaning, possibly socialist, because you are so far from center. Whereas even a centrist from before the 1980s was now viewed as being left of center. So if you want to be a conservative, you have to go really far to the left. Where if you were a crazy far right-winger back, in the 1970s, you are now much closer to mainstream Central America as a result of the Reagan Revolution. And so the Democrats realize that if they want to win an election, they have to change their message. And what they became is what we call neoliberalism, or in this case, the New Democrat. And so the Democratic Leadership Council would form in the late 80s to reform the Democratic Party and American liberalism. The Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, would argue that Democrats were too liberal, too eager to embrace big government, and therefore had alienated much of that mushy middle America. And so DLC-affiliated politician, Bill Clinton, they would call themselves the New Democrats. Again, this is a product of the Reagan Revolution, that the Republican Party had become more conservative, and the Democratic Party, as a result, needed to also move to the right. And the result of this was New Democrats like Clinton, they became more conservative. They embraced things like fiscal conservatism, market solutions rather than big government, a rejection of government spending under Keynesian economics. The DLC and the New Democrats also moved away from their African American and Latinx working class constituencies. They moved far more toward big donors and military industrial corporations. Under Clinton, Democratic Party and America in general would embrace a much more conservative agenda. And under Clinton, things like Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military, the Defense of Marriage Act, and his crime bill would all be passed that are much more conservative in nature. Now, there were some very good reasons for this, and we don't have time to discuss every one of them, but I do want to discuss the crime bill specifically. Because in 1992, Bill Clinton and Al Gore win the election, and they embrace this new model of the New Democrat, more centrist, more conservative. And so in 1994, Clinton will sign the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, aka the crime bill. And on the surface, it does some good things. At least it sounds like good things. It increased hate crime sentences. Okay, so if you commit a crime based on race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, you can be tried for a hate crime and now longer sentences. Okay. It contained the Violence Against Women's Act, which allocated $1 billion to prevent and investigate rape and violence against women. Good thing. It cracked down in other ways, though, by adding 100,000 new police officers to control crime. Put more officers on the street. That sounds good in theory. It increased mandatory minimum sentences. It expanded the use of the death penalty. Added $9.7 billion for construction of prisons. It also introduced what was called the 3 strikes language that mandated life in prison after 3 violent or drug felonies. It also introduced the idea of what was called broken windows policing. This idea that police needed to crack down on even minor offenses in order to maintain law and order in urban America. And more police departments began to use it, saying, hey, no, even if it's a minor offense, we got to crack down hard on it. Otherwise, it'll grow into more violent crime. Again, theoretically, this all sounded good to the American public. The problem is when you start talking about urban America, start talking about adding more police officers, broken window policing, where do you think they go looking for crime at? It isn't suburban America, mostly Anglo. No, it's the inner cities, lower socioeconomic areas, black and brown areas. Look on the screen right now. Part of it increased the prison sentences for drug-related crimes. So if you're caught with drugs, in this case, cocaine, you will get a mandatory 5-year prison sentence if you're caught with 500 grams of powdered cocaine. But if you're caught with just 5 grams of crack cocaine, you get 5 years in prison. Which demographic of people do you think smoke powdered cocaine? Rich, elite, white. Because they can afford. Cocaine's expensive, I've been told. And those who are snorting it are often people who live in the penthouses, urban lofts, suburbs, rich businessmen, usually Anglo. Who do you think smokes crack cocaine, a cheaper smoked form of cocaine? It's the poor people, lower socioeconomic groups on the streets, in the barrios, in the ghettos, in the urban centers, mostly black and brown. And this had been a thing that had been building since 1980s, thanks to the war on drugs, the Just Say No campaign, DARE in schools. This was the idea of being tough on crime. Just Say No campaign. Think about this for a minute. I'm going to give you a story here. Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York. When he was a prosecutor in New York in 1986, he dressed himself up one night in a sleeveless Hell's Angel jacket, taken from the crime lockup of a criminal defendant. He then went into the Washington Heights neighborhood, home to numerous different Latinx groups. Now, if you've been following the news in 2021, there was a movie that came out based on a stage play, Broadway show, by Lin-Manuel Miranda called Washington Heights, or the movie was called In the Heights, and so was the play. And it was a story, of course, about Washington Heights, this barrio in New York City. Again, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's wonderful. But while the movie and the Broadway show paint it as a very vibrant cultural scene, and it is, for Rudy Giuliani, this was seen as a crime-infested area, full of drugs, disease, poverty, crime. And so one night in 1986, he dresses up wearing a Hell's Angel biker jacket, gang jacket. He then goes into the Washington Heights neighborhood with a senator along with him in tow to videotape him showing how easy it is to purchase a vial of crack cocaine. It was easily purchased, and then Giuliani used the incident to demand for mandatory prison sentences for even small amounts of crack. Like you see on the screen, mandatory 5-year sentence. But it begs the question, why did he choose to go there? Why did he choose to go down into what he considered the ghetto to purchase drugs, when he could have just as easily gone uptown to the rich lofts of Soho or the businesses of Wall Street and bought cocaine? And said the same thing, we should have mandatory sentences for even smaller amounts of powder cocaine. But he didn't. He made a choice based on preconceived racial prejudices and biases to demonize people that he wanted to make easy scapegoats of the so-called drug problem. They would make himself look tough as a prosecutor and eventually propel him to be mayor. And the thing is, this wasn't just Rudy Giuliani. Thanks to the crime bill, this was happening all across the country as police departments with new funding, more officers, theory of broken window policing begin to go into these urban neighborhoods where they expect to find crime, and guess what? They do. You will find crime where you look for it, whether it's in the rich areas or the poor areas. And the result of it was catastrophic for Blacks and brown peoples. Look at my stat on the screen. This is from 2003. But notice how all men, that you have a 1 in 9 chance that you will, at some point in your life, be imprisoned, compared to 1 in 56 for women. But when you break that down further, for white men, it's 1 in 17. For a Latino man, 1 in 6. For a black man, 1 in 3. And the stats bear out, same for women. For white women, it's 1 out of 111. Less than 1%. For Latino women, 1 in 45. For black women, 1 in 18. This is the result of choices. This is the result of demonizing and over-policing black and brown neighborhoods. These are all choices that are being made. And the results are catastrophic. putting more and more people in jail. And then when and if they get out, how much harder is it to find a job? Having a record, even for a minor offense. It perpetuates a cycle of poverty, of lower socioeconomic status, lower class status, still being relegated to second-class status. Now, we'll continue this discussion of what happened in the 1990s when we come back in the second half of this lecture. But until then, take care and bye-bye.